this discussion is about the winter weather hazards on the job and illnesses and injuries that can happen as a result of cold weather.
And who do we have joining us on the Voices of Safety tonight?
We have Gina Vanderlin, and we have Ken Leighton.
Right. Now, Ken, I know you're from Northern Safety, right? And Gina, you are from PSEG Long Island, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and you're going to be kicking us off tonight.
I guess I will be.
Yeah, well, jump in there. So share a bit about yourself to kick it off.
Sure. So I am actually a health and safety program manager with PSEG Long Island. We're an electric utility. Our service territory is actually Long Island in New York State. So I am a part of the Northeast. Winter weather hazards are definitely something that I have to consider when it comes to my workforce. I have the large majority of my workforce is outdoor workers, right? So there's a lot of exposure concerns there. Before I made the transition to utilities in 2019, I was previously with aerospace manufacturing, also on Long Island, which has been my home base. I'm born and raised New York. So I did spend some time in aerospace and manufacturing, and winter weather hazards exist there too. So just because you don't have a workforce that's primarily outdoors doesn't necessarily mean your workers aren't being exposed to cold stress hazards and winter weather hazards. So it really does impact all industries across the board. And just because you're not in the Northeast or somewhere like Canada, where I think Scott's from, right? Doesn't mean that you aren't subject to cold stress hazards anyway. A lot of the folks that are probably joining us tonight remember what happened over in Texas with the freeze that happened over there. So winter weather can really happen at any time across the country. So we have a lot in store today.
And really cold stress, that's actually, like, can you explain that for people just so we have some clarity on that terminology?
Yeah, so cold stress is often one of the first things that you think about, right? That immediately comes to mind when you're talking about winter weather safety, right? And cold stress happens when you drive down your skin temperature, and then it eventually reduces your internal body temperature, right? So when the body is unable to warm itself, it becomes susceptible to serious cold-related injuries and illnesses. A lot of the key ones that we talk about when we talk about cold stress injuries are chilblains, right, which is kind of the minor onset of skin irritation, trench foot, frostbite, and hypothermia. And frostbite and hypothermia are two of the big ones because those are medical emergency situations. So that's kind of what we mean when we're talking about injuries and illnesses that are winter related. Major contributing factors when you're talking about winter weather hazards are air temperature, air movement, which would be wind speed, and believe it or not, humidity, which would be wetness. Those are sort of the three key factors that contribute to the onset or possible onset of winter-related cold injuries and illnesses.
Big difference between a dry cold and a wet cold.
Yeah, and for those of you that are familiar with the New York territory, right, and especially Long Island, because we're an island and we're surrounded by water, we typically have very hot and humid summers here. And then our winters are very cold and snowy, and we're susceptible to nor'easters, especially in the early parts of spring in February and March. And those can be pretty nasty from a weather perspective.
And so, Gina, how does, if somebody has like a pre-existing health condition, can that impact them more severely than others who don't?
Sure. I mean, your physical fitness level, medications that you're taking, body conditioning, what your actual work responsibilities are, those are all factors that go into the susceptibility of your workforce in terms of potential risk exposure, right? So If you have someone that is on medication that may affect circulation and blood flow, that person's going to react differently to cold weather situations than maybe somebody that's not on that type of medication or has that type of health condition. So that's always a concern when you're talking about outdoor workforces.
So go ahead, ask your question.
I saw you mentioned medication, but tobacco and alcohol are a big contributor to that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And on the tobacco and alcohol, right? Dehydration is a big one. It's not something that we typically talk about when we think of winter hazards. It's not something that comes to mind right away. But one of the things that I always tell my crews is dehydration is actually a winter hazard too, right? Your body still produces sweat. A lot of times you're wearing multiple layers, and because of that, your body is sweating and it's going through its natural processes, right? So you should avoid alcohol consumption, obviously, while you're at work for for regular work purposes. You should not be on any kind of illegal substances, right? But in terms of drinking sugary juices, you should avoid things like caffeine. A lot of times those are our go-to drinks because people are tired and they're cold and they want a nice hot cup of coffee. But you're actually better served drinking things like coconut water. And one of the tips that actually came from one of my safety captains was they said, if you don't like the taste of coconut water, you can actually add honey into it and it'll sweeten it up and give it more of a palatable taste. And coconut water is great because it has a lot of electrolytes in it. We also keep the electrolyte packages on hand to give to our field crews, and we encourage them to mix it in with their drinks, their water, and to pack snacks too throughout the day, because it's all part of eating a healthy diet and also eating food while you're out there and working, because your body burns more calories as it's trying to keep warm.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up, Malcolm, cigarettes like tobacco, because I'm not sure how much we educate people about how nicotine can impact physiologically our process of our temperature gauge in the body. So that's a good one, like as we're going into colder weather, to kind of think about how can we educate and share that knowledge.
When one of your outdoor workers is going to be working in, I'm sure there's below zero temperatures up there, even if things have to get done, and they're the ones that are out there when the rest of us are out of power. What types of equipment do they need to bring that's a little bit different than when they're working in maybe not so cold temperatures?
So that's a really good question, right? Because one of the biggest mitigative factors that we use when we're talking about cold stress prevention, right, is proper attire, right? And it's not just layering, but you have to have the proper attire for the hazards you're being exposed to too, right? So linemen, electrical workers, one of our high hazards is electricity, right? So a lot of our requirements are FR clothing. So, and for FR clothing, you have to wear cotton clothing underneath. So you have to be very cognizant about the types of socks you're recommending people to wear, about the types of boots and the types of outerwear and the protective wear. It's not as easy as just going to the store and picking up a couple of sweatshirts and making sure that you're layering them on underneath your regular work clothing. You have to be cognizant of all that. I think it's also really important to note that one of the biggest complaints of cold weather is when you're wearing eye and face protection, you have a fogging issue, right? Because your breath is nice and warm, and especially if you're wearing something like a face shield, right, and you're breathing out, it tends to fog up. So it's really a good idea if you need full face protection to have your eye protection either separately or in like a vented goggle that's separate from your mouthpiece so that it doesn't fog up. And I know they also make like anti-fog wipes and sprays that you can kind of pre-treat your equipment for, but it's really important to keep that in mind for those that have to wear face shields and other type of head and face protection, because cold weather can make it very difficult to see in that type of equipment.
Gina, I've also got a question, actually two questions related to cold stress and exposure. One would be related to age of the individual and the factors that are associated with that. The other one is related to conditioning or acclimatization. If you could speak to those two, please.
Sure. So I'll tackle the acclimatization first, right? We talk about this when we talk about heat stress a lot. Cold stress in a lot of ways is very similar. It's just the opposite temperature. But you have to be very cognizant of your activity level that you're expecting out of people, right? And also how they've been working previously, right? So somebody that spends the majority of their time indoors in a climate controlled environment is going to have a very tough time if you all of a sudden stick them in some layers and push them out there and say, hey, you're going to work a 12-hour day out in the field, because your body is not acclimated to those temperature extremes. And so it's going to work extra hard to keep you warm in that situation, right? And it's going to put a lot of extra stress on your body. So a good rule of thumb is to really condition people to cold weather. And I used to do a lot of field work back when I was in environmental. And I remember that because I spent so much time outside, the cold didn't bother me as much as other people. So I'd go out with my family and they'd be like, we're so cold. And I'm like, this is great. It's so much warmer than it's been for the last week, you know? And it's really just because my body had acclimated to that as sort of its baseline, right? And it didn't struggle as much to keep up and to maintain that core body temperature as somebody that didn't have that exposure. So there's definitely a window of time there where you have to give people an adjustment period, an onset into that colder weather, and really get them acclimated and prepared to kind of experience those temperature extremes. And then going back to the first part of it, which is age, right? This is something that I think is really important because we're seeing more and more multi-generational workforces, right? We've talked a lot about millennials and Gen Z, and you have the mix now, Gen X. Depending on your age, right, along with your physical condition, you know, medications that you may be on, pre-existing health conditions, all of those factors do contribute into how well your body can adjust and maintain and adapt to the stresses of working in a cold work environment. So those are really important factors to consider. I think it's really important as a safety professional to have a good understanding of your age demographic and who is out there doing that work. And plan for that, right? Bring those people in, get their input on things that make them comfortable, make sure that there are places that they can take breaks, places that they can fuel up with snacks and food and water, and that their PPE is comfortable and you know, easy for them to work in. And I think that feedback is really, really important when it comes to that type of workforce situation.
Great suggestions, Gina.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the layering of the clothing and stuff, because as you get out in the environment, like you said, you know, you continue to sweat and stuff like that. And sometimes you have to remove layers or open up layers, you know, to keep the core temperature where you want it, you know, and then as your activity decreases, you know, pick up those layers again to prevent injury. Those are some really good points. Thank you.
Yeah, and layering is really important, right? Because it does allow that opportunity. You know, sometimes when we get ready as children, right, a lot of times it's like, okay, put on your hat, your gloves, your coat, you're good to go, right? But when you're working out there and you're doing varying levels of physical activity, it's really important to consider what's right up against your body, what might be a buffer in between, what types of code, what type of weather conditions you might be encountering. Is it going to be really windy? Is it going to be rain? I've been stuck in freezing rain before, and it's just awful. I also make sure that with a lot of my folks, we advise them to keep a spare pair of work boots and socks in their car. And this again goes back to trench foot, right? And trench foot, when we talk about it and think about it, we immediately, I at least immediately connotate it with the military, right? And hot work environments and things like jungles, because that's really, it's a buildup of, sweat essentially in your boots, and it's not aerating out and breathing, and it can cause a lot of skin damage and irritation. The same thing is true in the winter. The wetness gets trapped in there, right? And then the freezing weather contributes to it, and it exacerbates the skin damage. So I always tell my folks, it's good practice to have a spare pair of boots with you, because you never know what's going to happen there. And also a spare change of socks too. A couple, if you can keep them with you, because nothing is more miserable than getting wet and being in wet work boots and standing out there and being really, really cold. So that's also a good tip in terms of layering and preparedness. And if you're somebody that works outdoors quite a bit, get yourself a boot warmer or a boot dryer, because nothing is better than coming home and popping your boots on one of those boot dryers and letting it actually dry out the soles. Because if you're working day after day after day, they can retain the moisture. And so at night, sometimes they don't dry out naturally, and you have to kind of help that process along a little bit.
Now, I remember in the retail store, because we're here in Toronto, so we've got a lot of slushy cold weather, and we would actually provide galoshes for people to be putting over, right? So that's another thing, is like, what are you thinking about providing?
Yeah, so, I'm a big fan of, and again, it depends on the work environment that you're going to be in, right? You have to make sure that the attire that you're giving people is suitable for the hazards that they're going to be encountering, right? If I have an FR situation, I have to be cognizant that I can't send somebody in there with something that wouldn't be, appropriate to wear over their clothing. But I like the point you bring up about things like boot covers, because I think it does come to another important point, and that's really the transition from wet surface to dry surface in terms of your shoes. And so when I worked in manufacturing, right, we had this workforce that was primarily an indoor workforce, but you had folks that arrived every day in the parking lot and had to make the slushy trek into the building, right? And in that case, I think some of the best protection methods against slips, trips, and falls was really to put the slip resistant mats, the all weather mats, in the doorways, right? And to make sure that if you had umbrellas, even for wet and rainy weather, umbrella stands with absorbent pads under them were also a really good practice. Because hallways get slippery fast. So there's always a huge risk factor when you're transitioning from that outdoor environment to an indoor environment. And so you have to be cognizant of that as well when you're kind of talking about, over booties and other covers. Also giving people a station to change out their attire, right? I know that I have a favorite pair of snow boots that's great in the snow, and I can't drive in them because they're clunky and they're heavy. And so giving people a space to put that attire down and to change out of it is also a really important consideration. You want people to be able to be comfortable, but also maneuver in their attire. So I think that's important.
Well, I'm hoping that, Ken, you're still with us. Do you, as we're going into the discussion about what type of products and PPE that we could be bringing into the workplace in this discussion, has anything been coming top of mind to you that people are often coming to you for?
Well, so recall my expertise is the health and safety field as well. More specific, this is rather than the PPE side of things. But I will say, Gina brings up really great points. I mean, it's the layering aspect. It's how can we provide that extra layer of comfort in footwear. We're seeing a lot of customers that are really taking a little more interest in footwear, especially the cold winter months, than I think I've seen in the past. I grew up in in Maine as a kid, and grew up in the 5-foot snows and 10-foot snows, and but being cold was my happy place. So I think I'm in good company with some Canadians. I've got some French Canadian in my lineage, so I think the cold gene is there. And the PPE side of things, we're seeing a lot more care given to how are we going to equip our outdoor workers. I've spent a lot of time in the mine industry and outside construction, and myself have been in construction and antenna systems and been out there in the cold. The quality of materials now that we're providing with hats and hoods and liners and gloves, overalls and coveralls. I mean, these are really important aspects. I think that a lot of businesses may take for granted that, cold weather emergencies are real. We tend to focus a lot on the heat side of things, right? If you look back in the historical narrative of safety, there's so much more about heat stress and heat injuries and hydration and things. It's equally important in cold related environments, and even in not so cold, like Gina pointed out, you don't have to be in sub-zero weather to get dehydrated and then succumb to hypothermia. So, water supplements, squenchers or drinks or something that can provide electrolytes, all of those things are really things that we can provide and that we're seeing an uptick in, and I like to see that because more people are thinking about how can we manage this proactively.
Absolutely. I think it's also important to highlight that just because we're in winter weather, there are some environments where they've got cold conditions inside the workplace also. So like when we were again in retail, we had freezers and refrigerators, right? So it's good that you're bringing up some of these things because it gets you thinking about if somebody is working more in the freezer when they're doing the stock changeover, right? Mm-hmm. Where they may be, workers tend to go in somewhere like that. And you have to pull them out because they get their music on and they start grooving. And next thing you know, somebody's in the freezer for like 45 minutes. It's like, yeah, you got to come out of there now, warm up.
Right.
So
right.
what kind of ideas do you have for that?
So I've seen that in the poultry processing part of the business. And, I've done assessments and spent a good number of time, and that's a cold environment from, morning till noon to end of day. I mean, they are in a cold environment to keep this poultry frozen. So, it's making sure the ears are kept warm, the throat's kept warm, the chest is warm, making sure that they do have these breaks because it's important for people to stop doing what they're doing. And especially, Gina, you made a really great point with millennials and really cross-generation. Not everybody is able to work the same environment for the same length of time under the same duress, right? Not new hires they just don't have the experience. So we're noticing you've got to accommodate longer break cycles for them until they really get stepped in and they're really acclimatized, or work hardened, right? We've all heard that term. Growing up as a kid, my work hardening was don't complain, kid, just get out there and do it. We can't say that today, however, but it's the same concept. And so we're seeing really the need to make sure their shoes aren't too tight, right? That the people that are sizing these shoes are not squishing their toes in, right? Because we've talked about space is important, and Malcolm, I think you brought a good point up. You've got to be able to have space and ability to take things off as you get hot, and having the wrong kind of shoes really exacerbates the situation. I don't know if any of you had close to frostbite. I've skied and ice fished growing up. When you get that, when your feet are cold, everything seems to stop. The focus seems to be on your feet and what you can or can't do. So warming pads, or making sure that they understand they can take their shoes off maybe between breaks and get some circulation back into the feet. I was an EMT years ago, and the service is one of the things that I did on the side. And I taught a lot about cold related injuries when I was in Europe. And that was something that we really talked often about. So I find it's exciting to be able to have this group of folks out here and talking about this.
You know, this is great. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to ask either Ken or Gina, Kenneth or Gina?
What
Yeah,
about the hand warmers and the foot warmers that you just see at your local drugstore? Are those sufficient to keep your hands and feet warm? And I mean, are there any and I don't, are there any warnings about those, or are they good?
Gina, I'll let you talk about that because you kind of brought that up earlier. You may have a better thought.
Yeah, so again, I think situational awareness is really important. You know, how are you going to use it? I will say that back when I was doing environmental consulting field work, I was often on sites that had no amenities. They were either abandoned or open fields, and you know, you're out there sometimes 10, 12, 14 hours for the day. You have the vehicle to go back into, but you know, you're trying to take notes and write with your pen and your hands are cold. And so I have used hand warmers and boot warmers before, and I do think that they add a level of comfort if, again, it's an appropriate situation, right? I probably wouldn't advise my linemen to stick them in their high voltage gloves or their low voltage gloves, right? But if it's somebody that, you know, is maybe doing traffic control and has to stand out all day and is holding a sign, then boot warmers might be appropriate for that person to add that level of comfort to them. With any PPE product, right, we always tell people use it based on the manufacturer's instructions, right? You don't want to do something that is an inappropriate use of it, because that's how injuries and illnesses result, right? So you don't want to pack 15 of them in there, have a chemical reaction or cause, you know, a damage to occur to the product, right? And then maybe there's some skin contact there and some skin irritation. So I think it's all within, you know, acceptable parameters and really evaluating it as a tool for it. And I will, you know, add to your question earlier. I know you were asking about outdoor PPE for foot protection. And I will say that there are a lot of options nowadays on the market for traction devices. And we've, you know, piloted a couple. Throughout my safety career, I've piloted a couple of them. Things like the Yak Tracks, which are nice because they fit over your shoes. So it's not like a totally different shoe that you have to put on. You just kind of get it in and around your shoe size and it clips right on. And it actually is like these spiral metal pieces that are on like this bungee cord type of tread, right? That goes under your boot. And it helps create traction on surfaces that are very slippery, so snowy and icy surfaces. Now, it's not a fail-safe, right? You still have to walk carefully, especially if you're going to be on really icy surfaces. But I have found that those do make a difference. And then they have higher up on the gamut, the Yak Tracks are usually like lower end stuff. I love them because you can buy them in bulk and keep them and hand them out like candy, right? Because people love to lose that stuff. But if you're going for a more expensive option, you have something like a Spiky Neo, which is a full-on overboot, and those do have almost like ice cleats to them. And those I've heard great reviews, especially folks that have to like traverse long distances, particularly people that do like outdoor winter weather activities like hunting and fishing and ice fishing, where they're on those snowy and icy surfaces. So we've used a variety of those too. And again, it depends on the circumstance, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it.
You know what I wonder about, because we're doing a lot about technology and software right now in our demo days and stuff, right, Scott? And it's kind of thinking about, is there anything that could be like a sensor that you could put in somebody's footwear or handwear so that it alerts them if if they're getting to that point?
I haven't heard of any of that, and I sort of old school a little bit too. I lean towards the common sense approach also of, you know, if you know you're getting colder, stop what you're doing for a few minutes. And I don't mean to say that in a way to nullify the technology aspect of things, but I think over complicating some of the symptoms that we have, right? Let's just say, for example, if someone was waiting for that signal to go off or waiting for that alert and it failed, right? And they just kept pushing through and they kept working through. Sometimes that tech could be a little, we rely too heavily on it. And so going back to understanding, you know, making sure you're suiting up right, making sure you're gearing up right, make sure you know that it's okay to stop working. And it kind of goes back into what's the management of safety doing, but what are the supervisors doing on the job, right? Because I've managed a lot of people in the field, and the minute I leave, they'll say, okay, let's get back to work. And it's modus operandi based on the supervisor, right? So if we can blend all of these things in with the right PPE and the right protocol and the ability for that worker to say, hey, I got to stop. Stop work authority applies to this, in my opinion, too, is if you get to a point where you're too cold to work or you're in a dangerous position, you know, hey, time out.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. And kind of to Gina's example of greenfield construction, the crews are out there getting paid by the hour. And I remember on one job site, a dispute, you know, the workers wanted to keep working because that's how they're going to get paid. And the supervisor, the safety officer was saying, the wind chill is much too cold. You know, you get 20 seconds of exposure, your skin is going to freeze. You guys have to come, you know, get off the job site and get into an area where you can stay warm and protected. And I'm just wondering if, you know, because, you know, we are much more aware of the hazards and we're talking about it more, if there is more of a standard or best practice out there where the safety officer doesn't have to make a judgment call, where it can be written into policy, you know, or the safety program to say, hey, if these conditions arise, you're not permitted to climb 3 stories up the scaffold and keep working. You have to come in and shelter. So just curious.
Well, you know, Scott, OSHA in the U.S., of course, OSHA's been pushing the cold weather and heat related illness approach over some time now, is because that's been sort of a sticky wicket of how do you enforce that. So I think it needs to be written into program policy. I think it needs to be enforced from the top leadership down. You know, I think we've all run into this scenario where, you know, you have hardworking employees. They want to do what's right for the company. They're going to make their money, especially if they're getting paid time and a half or extra. Money's the motivator, to be sure. But policy needs to be written, I think, to look out for best interests, right? And I hate to say that we're not going to be the popular kids on the block for going out there and telling them to come on in out of the rain, or, you know, come in out of the cold.
Be popular with their families, though, when they come home at night.
You know, it really is. And we've got to do that because we don't want fatalities. We don't want illnesses and injuries leading to fatalities. My son's best friend in high school, they're seniors, just day before yesterday, her father was killed on a work zone in North Carolina. The same roads that I've worked, the same construction zones I've been on, and just taken away. And, you know, when my son called me the night before last, he said, Dad, I just want to hear your voice, because he knew I worked on those roads. And we go back to, you know, Scott saying, you've got a safety person out there. They're telling these folks to come in. They're doing the right thing. And policy has to back and support that. Because if we don't have that, then we're going to have more fatalities. We're going to have more serious illness and injuries. And nobody's really going to take that ownership and saying, well, what happened, right? Training is wonderful. At the end of the day, it's what do we hold them accountable to do is what we know is right, because that's what we know, right? We can tell them to wear the best gear in the shop. We can buy the best stuff from our company and whoever else is out there. If they fight it and they don't do it, that's the disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I get passionate and excited about this, guys. I apologize. It's sort of like I've run into these scenarios before in heat related stuff. Hey, come on out of the heat. You know, it's like, why? I'm fine, you know. But then you go to the wet bulb globe temperature, right? The thing that we've been trained on understanding how to calculate this temperature. You know, how do you calculate this and then base what is your expected time for rest, right? Employees have to have rest. But over the decades, we have not really enforced that. And I think we've seen it in steel industries. I think we've seen it in cold climates, railroad industries that are out there in cold temperatures. Even in Texas or places where they don't anticipate being struck by cold. You know, how do you manage it? So there's some good things happening, I think. And it's a long-winded response, but I think policy is really where it needs to be driven.
No, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. Everything has to come down, you know, from corporate on down. Everybody has to be on board for it to work, including the person, you know, the frontline people who have to make that split-second decision whether or not to be safe.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right.
Malcolm, I saw you raising your hand there. What
Yeah.
are you thinking?
You know, with the technology today, we do have things available to supplement, you know, the safety person out there for protection of the employees. You have weather meters. You also have the weather apps for your smartphones that you can monitor that also raise an alarm. The other thing is thermometers, you know, put them in the area where the workers can look at the temperature and stuff and know what they're being exposed to. And, you know, when I was with ExxonMobil, you know, we worked in Siberia and up in that way. We'd have cold weather work plans that, you know, described the clothing needed, warming shelters, extra clothing, and provisions if a blizzard came while you're, you know, at a work site, what to do and what to have on hand, and also communications with your supervisors, because a lot of times we worked remotely, and so you had to be able to let know people that you were doing fine, you know, so you had to do report in like a checkpoint and stuff like that. And also we did that for our travel too during cold weather. You know, we had checkpoints. Once you reached that checkpoint, you had to call in on the radio and let them know you were there. And then we had established break times, you know, where employees took a break, ate, you know, took in water and food. And then some of the other things that you mentioned, you know, slip hazards and stuff like that, those are really important to identify. Also, there are secondary infections and stuff that are caused by cold weather, drying of the skin. So you got to consider moisturizers. If you have an existing wound or something like that, you're susceptible to infection, you know, so those got to be protected. And then back to the PPE, you know, is always do an evaluation, you know, of the work environment and buy to that, and then train your employees on how to do that. And especially what Gina mentioned, you know, as far as layering, they need training on that. You know, we do it naturally on some things, you know, you get hot, you take your sweater off, but, you know, you got to be able to monitor that and, you know, how to protect yourself. And I think everything put out so far has been excellent.
And sometimes it's also about having the gear available to them. You know, I know in the store, like we had parkas for extreme cold weather, because we're working with, we have like part-timers who can't really afford that kind of polar winter gear when it's needed. And they don't need it for just kind of shuffling around the city. But if they're out in the parking lot, you know, for a long period of time, that's totally different than what they might be doing day to day. So we would have like a stock that staff could use. So making sure that that's available.
So I just wanted to circle back to some of what Malcolm was saying, right? One of the things I really loved was the driver checkpoint system, right? Because you know, in a utility, a lot of times we deal with lone workers, folks that, you know, are going out by themselves or have to do a job by themselves. And this is where, you know, the intersection of data management can be helpful. So something like an AVLS system where you can ping your vehicles, you know, and find out where they are and where those folks are. If you can't get in touch with them, you know, you can send somebody out to check in or do a buddy system with it. I think that's really important too. And you know, I love his idea of putting the temperature out there. And I think this, you know, factors back into that multi-generational workforce again, right? I guess I'm probably in the millennial time bracket here. But I know that, you know, I've acclimated just fine to my smartphone and I rely on it for quite a bit. And I love downloading all the neat apps like the Sound Meter app. And so, you know, you have to capitalize on that generational gravitational pull towards some of the technologies, right? Some people really do love, you know, having an app for that and letting it tell them what's going on or setting an alarm. And so I do, you know, during safety meetings and safety briefs, whenever I come across something good like that, I always encourage my folks to download it and keep it with them. And you know, the message that I hope it's sending is, yes, you know, we want your safety person to be responsible for you and your supervisor, but safety is also your responsibility, right? You are not prohibited from taking the power into your own hands and giving yourself this tool and, you know, using it as leverage to reach out to your supervisor when you have a question or when you encounter something that you're concerned about. Hey, I've been out here for a while and nobody's checked in with me and my temperature gauge is saying it's pretty cold out here, you know, am I going to get some relief? And so, you know, I always think that that's just extra padding, right? And I agree with what Ken said. It's really important to have those policies in place, to have that leadership communicating and modeling the message. But I think giving your workers, your frontline folks, the power to stand up for themselves and advocate for themselves with the data is also just really important.
Yep, I agree.
One of the things that was kind of touched on, just acclimating to the cold weather, but and it's similar again with heat stress, but you know, I find cold weather is really fatiguing, you know, on people, and so for safety professionals who might be working in these environments for the, you know, only the first or second time, like how do you stay on alert for fatigue? How do you guard against fatigue? And you know, how do you help employees recognize it as well? Because you're out there in the cold, it can kind of creep up on you without you really noticing.
You know, one of the things that I've encouraged people to do is to learn how to understand where their resting heart rate is, learn where their respirations are, you know, before they start taking activity, and recognize when you're starting to really breathe heavily and your mouth's open and you're starting to lose a lot of that precious moisture and heat out of your body. It takes a little time, right? It's sort of like you take baby steps to help them understand where their limits are. You know, if they're really trudging through some heavy snow or some heavy, deep stuff, and they're really straining to lift their legs out, and, you know, talk about how to recognize fatigue in the muscle areas, their hamstrings or their quads or wherever, and to take a moment to pause and just take a breather. To me, that's been the best way, and I've taught my children that, and I've taught you know, other folks with cold related injuries. You know, this stuff creeps up on you, right? Making sure they take that water break, make sure they have that water and they keep sipping, even when they don't believe they're thirsty. That's going to help, in my opinion, get them along and get them acclimated to really where Gina was like, you know, I'm not even cold. And her family's looking at her like, what? Right. You know, that's sort of a badge of honor when you reach that ability. You know, it's, but that's what I do is have them take those steps, have them really understand their body. Because a lot of people wouldn't even know what their resting heart rate is if you ask them. Well, how do I find it? How do I count? You know, just give them those tools so that when they're in the field, I think that gives them a little measure of support.
Have people look out for each other too. You know, if you're not recognizing that you may be, getting too cold, then have a culture where somebody's comfortable bringing it up and saying, hey, you know, I think that maybe you're getting too cold. Why don't you come in, or why don't you take a break, or, you know, warm up, and having the other person the same, you know, it's the same thing. You have to have a culture where the other person is accepting of the suggestion and
Well,
not defensive.
Laura, you really bring up a good point, and this is in all seriousness, right? Body composition and body fat content is really an important factor when you consider cold weather. I've worked with guys that were top notch, probably 5% body fat. You put them out in the cold and they're shivering like a leaf because they have no protection, right? There's not that fat layer to protect them. So body types are important, degrees, level of fitness. Just because you're 5% body fat does not mean you can handle the cold weather.
So Ken, you're saying I should be all set then, right?
I'm saying I should be fine.
Now, Dan, I see you unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, it was another point that sort of wraps together a number of comments made with people looking out for each other and helping each other, things of that nature. I do a lot of work with organizations here in Ontario where health and safety committees are very important and very valuable to the workplace. And I highly encourage and work with them, the workplace and their health and safety committees, to work together to look for what are the conditions that your workforce encounter, and what can you do to help support the health and safety of those workers within your organization. How can you help your management team manage health and safety to the best level? It's still the management's responsibility to manage health and safety, but what can you do to help support that? What do you know about the workplace conditions that you can provide some feedback, information, suggestions, additions to policies and procedures that may help that workplace deal with those kinds of conditions? Because among them, most of the workplaces I deal with are in manufacturing. And even though those are pretty much 90% or 95% indoor activities, there are some areas like loading docks and outdoors, maintaining the outdoor conditions of the workplace in terms of the yards, the walkways, and those kinds of things in the wintertime. And the loading docks, particularly in the wintertime, can be very treacherous and very cold and areas of concern. So working with the people who know what's going on, and working with management together to come up with ideas, suggestions, and methods to help improve the workplace conditions for those situations, also very helpful.
Absolutely.
Good point. Yeah, a lot of good points there.
And Dan, you bring up a good point, and I think it becomes an honest assessment of what are the hazards in a work environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really, what are the honest risks? You know, if you've got a tarmac worker at an airport and they're de-icing airplanes, you know, what are their particular hazards that they've got to deal with? If you're a refueling operations and you're constantly having your hands gripped around a nozzle, you know, your tips are going to get colder faster because your blood's not going to be there as much, right? Malcolm, I'm sure you've seen this in Siberia, working with tools. You know, your pressure points are different. So that's really the analysis of the hazard needs to be accurate. It just can't be you need gloves, you need goggles, you need a hard hat, you need a hat, right? And I think we're seeing some of this focus change, which is good to see, but I think we have a way to go yet, because there's a certain factor of a bravado involved here with your ability to take the temperature, right? There's a pride level, how cold can you get, or how hot can you get, or how hard can you work without gloves, and how thick are your blisters, right? We're dealing with, that factor in the world of safety as well.
They used to call the cowboys.
There
The
you go.
macho ones that wanted to just see, how far they could go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's still out there very much.
Yeah, and I think hopefully we'll erode that it's better to work smarter, and then you can actually be productive. If that's your goal, is to be productive, then but I like what you said also about management support. It's very important that the manager does come and say, hey, come inside and have that warm drink break. That's something that's expected as part of looking after yourself on the job.
Yeah, and along with that too, it's even as simple as managers understanding what goes on in the workplace, not just looking after the dollars and cents, which of course is important to the business. Wouldn't be a business if it wasn't for that aspect of the business, but knowing what it takes to make those dollars and cents happen within the business, and the kinds of conditions that the workplace faces at times of challenge, particularly. Yeah.
Well, we're almost at our time. Did anybody have any other thoughts, Gina, Ken, that you'd like to leave people with?
Real quick, my thought is just to remember the basics.
Mm-hmm.
Just there's a lot of value to basic safety and how to apply it. I think if cooler heads prevail, not to be too good there, but yeah, that would be a message I would say is keep things simple, manage it, and we'll get better.
Gina, did you have any final words?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably talk all night about winter safety hazards, and because, we're only looking at a really small portion of it. So I don't want anybody that's joining us, I don't want them to think that winter weather is limited to these particular injuries and illnesses, right? There's lots and lots of other factors that go into it, from equipment design and the types of tools that you're using, and just the work activities you're performing and what your hazards are. So my advice to everyone whenever we talk about this stuff is that use it as a platform, a leaping off point for your own programs, right? Because everything, even businesses in the same industry doing the same thing, are all different, right? We have different processes, different exposures, different work processes for doing the task, right? So it's really, really important to take a step back and to learn your own workplace, and the demographic that you're working with, and to get in there and talk to your workers, right? And to build that culture from the bottom up, because those are your frontline folks, right? And you got to get out there, and safety policy is great to have in place, but it doesn't help in the long run if your workers are out there and they don't understand what the policy is, or what it says, or why it says those things, right? So I always encourage folks to take whatever we say with a grain of salt, right? And customize it for your own needs, because there are a lot of great solutions out there, and not every situation is the same. So that's kind of the message I want to leave everybody with.
I'd jump in too and say, take those cold weather policies and best practices home with you as well. There's a lot of proactive safety on the job site, and then we go home and scale the ladder to put the Christmas lights up, or we're tired at the end of the day and don't want to clear the ice or snow off off the walks, and so I think that cold weather hazards and winter hazards don't just stop at the workplace. So think about them at home too.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think this was fantastic. I think that there was a lot of knowledge shared, and I think that that it was really great. I think we learned mostly to individualize the cold weather programs, because even like Gina said, if you're working in the same industry, it's going to be different for everyone depending on where you're working. And also something that I really hadn't thought about before, the individual who's working, the age thing, and if they already have some kind of condition that might make them more susceptible. I think that just taking everything into consideration for each job, and just encouraging them, trying to make them want to be safe. Oh. I guess that's our cue to leave, huh?
Somebody wants their dinner.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been great.
Time flew on this one.
I know, eh? Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye
Appreciate
till next time.
Yeah. Thank you.
it. All right.
Bye.